Hello, everybody. My name is Frances Hasso, and I'm a professor in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies here, and also history and sociology. And I'm very pleased to be here with you and also to be introducing Jasbir Puar to the 2024 Feminist Theory Workshop at Duke. I hope you will forgive a prefatory comment before I do so. It is surreal to be functioning in this rarefied academic feminist space while a US-funded, armed, and ideologically supported Israeli genocide of Palestinians that includes armaments with our names on them, a US-Israeli 17-year siege of Gaza that led to the Palestinian revolt of October 7, manufactured starvation, and targeting of every category of life and culture in Palestinian society is now in its sixth horrific month. To me, that it continues and we haven't yet stopped it is incredible. The liberation of Palestine, and I would add, among other places, Haiti, also a continuing victim of US imperialist extraction and violence right now, and even closer to Durham, are central to decolonizing anti-imperialist, anti-racist feminist projects that are not bounded by the geographic, intellectual, and ideological borders of the US and Europe, or the expensive gates of our university classrooms, research projects, and publication venues. Ultimately, all colonized people will free themselves, with their allies, and that includes Palestinians and Haitians, among others. But here I ask whether what we want in our ideal societies, or theorize and consider in our teaching and scholarship, is possible without acknowledging and addressing as part of these feminist projects these realities, which some of us might not directly suffer from, but whose workings and consequences are a lot closer than we may understand, including here in the city of Durham and on our campuses. Now I will turn to introducing Professor Puar. Jasbir K. Puar is Faculty of Arts professor at the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Race and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia, and on leave from Rutgers University, where she is professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies. She has authored 2 award-winning monographs, both of which I've taught. One of them is Terrorist Assemblages, Homo-Nationalism in Queer Times from 2007, Duke University Press. It was republished in 2017 as a 10th anniversary edition and is available in multiple languages. Terrorist Assemblages builds on feminist and queer scholarship on heteronormativity and homonormativity to develop the concept of homo-nationalism. The book examines the consolidation after September 11, 2001, in tandem with the racialized and Islamophobic securitization logic of the war on terror, an ideological human rights frame among US queers and their mainstream organizations that articulated a kind of exceptional homosexuality that was not only sexually, but also nationally normative and safe, homonormative, by dint of being aligned with Western imperialism. As she shows in the preface, this project relied and continues to rely on old tropes, Orientalist tropes, we might say, and typically used as foils, the symbolic, never material and historically situated figurations of Iranian and Afghan women and queers as particularly oppressed and in need of saving by Western wars, invasions, sanctions, proxy wars, and always capitalist extraction. These projects, the book shows, often dress themselves in the ideological garments and colors of Western feminist and gay and lesbian liberation. The second book, The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability, Duke University Press 2017, has also been translated into Spanish and Portuguese at least. The Right to Maim once again toils on the grounds of imperialism and racism, but this time with attention to population level embodiments and debilitation. Specifically, Puar is concerned with populations, quote, slated for death. This has been a theme so far today. Quote, slated for death or slated for debilitation. Both are forms of the racialization of individuals and populations that liberal disability rights frameworks, advocates for social accommodation, access, acceptance, pride, and empowerment are unable to account for, much less disrupt, unquote. Among these populations, she shows in the book, are disabled Black and Brown veterans, Black people shot by US police, more than 50% of who have disabilities, poor queer people, and Palestinians. Debilitation is a particularly important concept in focusing our attention not on individual disabilities, the basis of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is one of her chapters, but on eugenic traditions and other forms where entire populations here and over there are deemed worthy of being structurally slowed down, mowed down, dying prematurely of illness, and of course maimed. Thousands of Palestinian children have been deliberately maimed in the last 6 months. The last third of Right to Maim, in fact, focuses on such Israeli policies for Palestinians in Palestine. Right to Maim reminds us that selective debilitation of populations, including through starvation and siege, is built into racial capitalism, imperialism, and the wars in their service. In both books, which I recommend reading if you have not, since I cannot cover them thoroughly here, I see Puar as engaging the conundrum of arguing for inclusion, social justice, and transformation within the frames, institutions, and on the same terms of recognition that rely on illusions of who we might all become, where we are in the first place, and how power and resources are maldistributed among us. Puar has published also many articles, including one we read this week in the Palestine seminar, which I teach here at Duke, on citation and censorship practices in feminist scholarship and feminist and sexual politics. These issues are certainly relevant in the here and now as well, especially at our academic institutions, which have done their best to repress a lot of discussion, okay? I'll stop there. Please join me, don't get me started. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jasbir Puar.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, great. I want to thank Jennifer for the invitation to be here today, and Julie for all of the arrangements, Francis for the introduction and also the resetting of our attention. And Grace, that was a beautiful talk. Thank you so much. It is day 167 of the genocide on Gaza. More than 31,000 Palestinians have been murdered. The number of maimed Gazans is over 70,000. More than 1,000 children have had one or more limbs amputated, nearly 10 every day, most without anesthesia. More than 500,000 people, nearly a quarter of the population, are on the brink of famine, what has been called an engineered starvation, and the fastest escalation of a state of famine in modern history. And in fact, just a few days ago, the UN warned that 1.1 million Palestinians are at imminent risk of death. All 11 universities in Gaza, long considered military targets and attacked in 2008 and 2009, in 2014 and in 2021 have now been partially or completely destroyed. Over 231 scholars have been assassinated. Collectively, these are the literal enactments of what Palestinian scholar Karma Nablusi has called scholasticide. 350 medical staff have been killed, 120 ambulances destroyed. There are no properly functioning hospitals, and half of all buildings in Gaza have been damaged, if not flattened. So these recountings have become routine facets of our teach-ins, our rallies, our direct actions, our lecture presentations, our vigils. I'm here to contribute to what our Palestinian colleagues, comrades, friends, and beloveds have been forced to do repeatedly for months now, which is to reset the stage so as not to forget the carnage happening on our watch and in the service of our settler colonial governments, to witness the decimation of life worlds that will debilitate Palestinians for generations, and to note the failure of our radical, decolonial, and intersectional politics and theories to stop any of this. So today I'm going to do two things, the second of which is to review the current relevance, or not, of discourses on homonationalism and pinkwashing. But first, I want to contribute some historical context for the present moment, against which we must, despite our failures thus far, continue to struggle. Although the Israeli state insists again and again that its genocidal onslaught is a response to the events of October 7th, we know that history did not begin that day. What I will discuss here concerns the specific ways in which the Israeli state has been showcasing the intentionality of its violence, indeed its right to maim, subjugate, and murder the Palestinian population of Gaza, in a moment that now seems a kind of grim rehearsal for this current genocide. And I'm talking about Israel's assault on the 2018 Great March of Return protesters, in which Israel sought a specific ways that seem to be horrible, uncanny echoes now, to unleash with utter impunity a kind of unmasked, intentional, baldly, proudly deliberate violence and cruelty, a violence and cruelty that is now intensified to a world-shattering degree. So this first section is called Nadia's Leg. In 1956, Palestinian freedom fighter Ghassan Kanafani wrote a short story titled Letter from Gaza, in which the protagonist, writing to his friend Mustafa, refers to Gaza as a, quote, amputated town. Visiting his niece at the hospital, the protagonist describes the scene of resignation and grief as he realizes why she is there. He writes, quote, "My friend, never shall I forget Nadia's leg, amputated from the top of the thigh." But he leaves the hospital only to find that, quote, Gaza was brand new. The blazing sun filled the streets with the color of blood. It seemed to me just a beginning. I don't know why I thought it was just a beginning, end quote. Kanafani portrays a distinct symbolic imaginary of the amputated leg, indeed Nadia's leg, as the advent of a Gaza that is brand new. Everything in this Gaza throbbed with sadness, which was not confined to weeping, he writes. It was a challenge. More than that, it was something like the reclamation of the amputated leg, end quote. So Kanafani's short story about Gaza as an amputated town suggests something long present in the Palestinian revolutionary consciousness regarding the amputated limb, about how the amputation, whether of the land, the body, the psyche, functions as an attempt by the colonial state to mark its power, but also the refusal on the part of the colonized to concede that power. Kanafani's protagonist hails the amputated leg as more than a wound or a mark or a biological manifestation of the colonizer-colonized relationship. The narrator's rousing reorientation is not a predictable call for resilience, but neither does it solicit the empathic humanitarian gaze. Rather, the amputated leg signifies the unqualifiable momentum of collective subjectivity that is in excess of, and therefore escapes, the strategic aims, calculations, and desires of the biopolitical state to strip Palestinian bodies of all vitality and resistance. Kanafani writes, quote, "I went out into the streets of Gaza, streets filled with blinding sunlight. They told me that Nadia had lost her leg when she threw herself on top of her brothers and sisters to protect them from the bombs and flames that had fastened their claws into the house. Nadia could have saved herself. She could have run away, rescued her leg, but she didn't," end quote. Letter for Gaza also speaks to a longue durée of maiming. The text forces a reckoning with the ongoingness of intergenerational Palestinian injury. A history of Israeli maiming of Palestinian bodies could have many beginnings, whether of the Nakba, the 1967 occupation, or the then defense minister's Yitzhak Rabin's infamous break their bones policy during the First Intifada. Rabin, responding to international concerns about the high death toll during the First Intifada, instituted this policy to punish Palestinian protesters, hoping to avoid international criticism for mass killing, all the while claiming a humanitarian stance towards Palestinians. Reports of the numbers of Palestinians killed during the 6 years of the First Intifada range from 1,100 to 2,000, but the number of injuries are anywhere up to 120,000, with 60,000 of those being in Gaza and at least 25,000 of them children. During the 2014 Gaza war, the spectacle of more than 2,000 civilian deaths reigned supreme, while over 10,000 injuries were seemingly unremarkable. These are both cases where maiming had a tactical value, either as a way to keep death tolls low or to create more destruction without attracting attention, or both, while constituting injury as incidental and not deliberate. In 2018, Gaza became the theater of explicit maiming, no longer accidental or incidental, but intentional in its scale and intensity, witnessed and sanctioned by global audiences. During the first 2 years of the march, 30,000 protesters were injured, over 7,000 of whom were shot in the lower limbs. Many of these injuries required amputations, multiple surgeries, or developed wound resistance due to insufficient antibiotics. Newspapers were rife with photos of men injured in the lower limbs, some with crutches or wheelchairs, some amputated. The theater of humanitarian crisis had been sealed with these and other empathy-inducing images of pain, images that Natasha Dillon notes are, quote, already decided in advance. And these images convey more about the humanitarian saviors than of the photographed Palestinians themselves. Even those representations that showed the protesters resisting in myriad forms were folded into the resilience narrative. Through this spectacle, the amputated limb had become a signature injury of sorts, a carceral assemblage of the humanitarian use of maiming, the media focus on disaster capitalism, and the tactical attempt to smother nonviolent protest. Signature injuries are to some extent biopolitically preordained, what a certain body is known for, what it is expected to endure and assimilate, even before it happens. While the Israeli government convened a conference on the Great March of Return to discuss the circulation of these photos as a public relations problem, I would argue that the pornographic documentation of the ravages of Israeli state power tends to performatively reiterate this violence by tutoring publics in the value of the Israeli body as national property, more so than conveying the realities of Palestinian resistance. During the Great March, this spectacle of humanitarian crisis shifted global attention from the vibrancy and epic magnitude of the nonviolent protests in a liberation movement, as Jihad Abu Salam explains, to the medical needs of an afflicted population, normalizing, indeed soliciting, global publics in the witnessing of not only killing, but also maiming Palestinians, effectively enacting at that time maiming as the apex of sovereign power. Disabling protesters as a means of hindering resistance while still claiming a humanitarian stance of sparing death and preserving life is an enactment of what Lisa Bongalia has called performance of moral violence by the Israeli military, which claims to be the most moral army in the world. This toggling between the sovereign right to kill and the biopolitical project of let live and let die is what I have called the right to maim. The right to maim is a mode of producing value from disposable bodies while all but ensuring a slow death. Maiming is also a tactical refusal of producing a victim subject, an abnegation of access to the version of the human manifested by human rights discourses. The harrowing question of what is deliberate and what is accidental haunts this connection between injury and death. If in 2014, for example, the high rate of injuries was considered secondary news and a derivative effect, during the Great March we see a clear shift from maiming as incidental to maiming as intentional. Sniping is an act of precision without any pretense of the accidental or of the liberal conviction that maiming is an inescapable and unavoidable consequence of war. The right to maim foregrounds the economic and ideological productivity of maintaining a population in the state of perpetual injuring, what I have otherwise called an underexamined, will not let die, will not make die vector of biopolitics. What this vector exposes is the liberal conceit at the heart of biopolitical thought, that letting live is always a gift, one which only functions as such in the context of the sovereign's right to kill. What at first appears to be the event of maiming is later revealed as embedded in the conditions created well before and long after the actual moment of injury due to overall environmental and infrastructural debilitation. Maiming, notes Jihan Basesio, outlasts media cycles and is not confined to an assault against the human biological form. It is rather a precondition that dictates the humanness or lack thereof accorded to Palestinian people and populations. Maiming is thus not only something that quote unquote happens to a body, rather it is folded into the ontology of resistance of what it means to live quote under occupation, quote under siege, quote in an open air prison. The siege has long relied on choke points deployed to titrate food, electricity, medical supplies, bodies, water, cement, fertilizer, humanitarian aid visas, medical travel permits, and so forth. All of these and more had been modulated for years to create an elastic, breathing, expandable, contractible scene of logistical governance. What Ghassan Abu Sitta called at the time titration of life entails individual data, normative metrics of health, fertility, thriving, stunting, birth rates, longevity, productivity, driving this mechanism of modulation, contraction, and expansion. The data that are collected on these quantities constitute and impose on Palestinians the metrics of individualization. Individualization does not rehearse the primacy of human forms. The individual is digital. It is a composition of data points that do not privilege a normal-abnormal binarization, but rather render a series of relations to statistical norms that inform titration as a technology of control, such that the experience of life is funneled into banal yet brutal empiricisms about health, infrastructure, reproduction, anything that can be capacitated and debilitated through monitoring and modulation. Titration is a type of security mechanism that generates this code of individual material to variably distribute and modulate time and again the elements central to livable lives, ostensibly to optimize a state of life. In the case of Gaza specifically, and Palestine more generally, these security mechanisms informing the logistics of containment were not about optimizing a state of life, but rather about the minimization of undesired mobility. By maintaining a population in a state of perpetual injury, sustaining chokehold technologies of enclosure, and calculating these metrics of maiming, the digital coordinates of the individual and not the individual, became the primary target of an inhumanist biopolitics, one conditioned through a move from humanity to pure capacity in their metrics. Titration is a form of modulation by degree that tempts a change in kind and approaches thresholds that cohere only retroactively. So if on one hand Gaza was determined by the UN in 2012 to be unlivable by the year 2020, announcing that safe drinking water has almost disappeared, the economy is cratering, and the state of unlivability is upon us, end quote. On the other hand, 2 million people continued to live in conditions with 97% water contamination, food and medical supply shortages, and generational mass debilitation. That is to say, the conditions of life of the Israeli blockade were unlivable, and yet somehow not understood by international law as potentially genocidal. Or it is also to say, at the very least, that Gazans had been living in a pre-genocidal state, a state primed for genocide, for at least 16 years. The notion of livability is therefore less a humanistic measure and more a pronouncement of the uneven demands to survive forces of exploitation and disposability. The livable-unlivable binary is usurped by the generating of incremental degrees of being. The blockade of Gaza has therefore been elastic. Containing what movement is imagined to be was as important as containing movement itself. On October 9th, Israel activated this elasticity of the blockade as it announced to the world its genocidal intent. Quote, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed," end quote. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said. Israel's unabashed, total right to destroy, in other words, is not a reaction to October 7th, but the implementation at an unspeakable scale of its long-asserted right to incapacitate, to control, and to implement its sovereign right to dispose of Palestinian lives. In describing a certain logic that predated October 7th, but also that set the scene for it, I'm flagging in part the shift from the remote occupation to intimate sniping, as well as a widespread showcasing and advertisement on the part of the Israeli state of its own right to destruction. As reported extensively in Haaretz on March 6, 2020, by Israeli journalist Hilo Glazer, soldiers tally the knees and/or limbs they have conquered at the end of each day. Glazer describes the chain of command through the words of this IDF commander. Quote, "For every sniper, there was a commander or a deputy company commander. The superior officer would request authorization to fire from the sector's brigade commander. He would get on the radio to him and ask, 'Can I add another knee for this afternoon?' End quote. Israeli soldiers' descriptions of sniper targeting suggest that there is a proprioceptive process akin to sensing, sifting, sorting. Individualizing does not break down or dismember the body, knees, ankles, or limbs, but rather never recognizes these disparate elements as part of the composite of the body in the first place. The target becomes not the Palestinian, but simply the or a limb. The economy of picking off bodies, lower limbs in this case, one by one, fuels a kind of affective renewal of settler subjectivity, a sadism that revels in the performative repetition of massacre, acting as source material for renewing settler colonial subjectivity and entitlement. Maiming is therefore not a one-off event, nor a structure, but a biopolitical circuitry through which bodies are positioned and repositioned into relations of living, dying, and injuring. This circuit is recursive in that the settler state freshens itself. This affective renewal of settler subjectivity refracts the structure of settler colonialism to the genocidal event and its iterations. And so this is the recursive circuitry by which settler claims to land become reinvigorated, as they are becoming reinvigorated now, through justification for violently squashing anti-colonial resistance that will never be recognized as such. The right to maim could be thought of as differently accentuated form of the right to kill because it avails itself of this recursive process. Fred Moten describes maiming as, quote, genocide through perpetual injuring, whereby killing resistance rather than bodies alone becomes the optimal goal. As such, maiming could be thought of as the reiterative performative of the founding event of settler colonialism that contributes to its enduring structure. It rehearses the violent separation of bodies from land, indebted to what Dylan Rodriguez has called the logic of evisceration, a genocidal logic of durational violence that reveals the incompleteness of the exceptionalized modern concept of genocide. We might pause at the temporal elongations of Moten's invocation of the perpetual, while still noting the recursive process of enfolding temporalities that continually collapses the event versus structure binary, so famously and importantly argued by Patrick Wolfe in terms of settler colonialism being a structure and not an event. The endless repetition of the founding moment renders porous the otherwise enclosure of the event in time, such that event and structure are no longer opposed, but neither do they disappear each other. Sniper tactics have been tested with regularity in the refugee camps in the West Bank from at least the First Intifada. What was the tactical value of using snipers and to touting the use of sniper tactics during the Great March of Return? In the context of the remote control occupation of Gaza, sniping indicated an unleashing of sovereign power that is sanctioned and conducted with impunity in front of a non-engaged international audience, a progressive stage in its renewed potency of sovereign power that continues to search and root around for its limits. Maiming in this instance is not a strategy to avoid the glare of the international community by keeping the death toll low. It is actually about producing the spectacle of disability, Palestinian maiming, that signals a life not worth living, contra this liberal fantasy that a disabled life is a life worth living. So to summarize this section for our purposes, 1, the zone of unlivability projected for Gaza by 2020 already conflicts with the prohibitions of the 1948 International Genocide Convention, which states that genocide is, quote, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, end quotes. In other words, a titration-driven biopolitics that works to induce necropolitics. Number 2, the demonstration of the impunity of Israeli sovereign power through spectacle-driven overt maiming can be thought of as a rehearsal, or at the very least a test ground for the current forms of genocidal violence it is enacting. And number 3, as many others have argued, using October 7th as a justification for Israel's genocide effaces the long decades of violence that Palestinians have endured. In this specific case of the Great March, the implementation of logics and tactical shifts used to target protesters are now fully and forcefully actualized. And this second section is called Queers for Genocide. So given all this history and this historical context and the present context and our conference here, I want to reiterate a question that Maya Mikdashi and I posed in 2017 in a piece titled Queer Theory and Permanent War. And in that piece, we asked, how can queer theory emerge and converse with mass corporeal losses and debilities of war? In a theoretical milieu where much of queer theory functions as a default American area studies, whereby the difference of the elsewhere is funneled through Euro-American Global North archives and lexicon, we pointed out that work on sexuality that is perceived as area studies, whether it is or not, is rarely apprehended as epistemic knowledge unto itself, rather treated as case studies of radical alterity from the global south. And here I'm thinking largely with Anjali Arandekar and Geeta Patel in their formative work on the special issue of GLQ titled Area Impossible. So Maya and I, unconvinced of the ongoing utility of the term queer, we continued by asking, quote, what animates the impulse to search for something to call queer or to theorize as queer? What must the queer body do or be to be recognized as such, and by whom? Do we want this recognition? And if so, how and for what purposes? End quote. So part of the problem, we speculated, is the centrality of sexual injury, in other words, the violence of gender binarism, to the Euro-American queer subject. At that time, we challenged what kind of injury is deemed appropriate for the basis of a wounded attachment that underpins the grievance of queer subjecthood, noting that, quote, part of the project of homonationalism is to produce and stabilize transnational, imperial, and settler colonial forms of sexual and gendered injury, end quote. So this legitimization of certain sexual and gendered injury not only adjudicates what injuries are legible and grievable, what counts as injury in the first place, but also takes for granted, quote, the economic, political, and military work that designations of sexual or gendered injury and violence does in the first place, end quote. Indeed, and in other words, what is erased are the forms of gendered and sexual violence intrinsic to the operations of war, occupation, and colonialism. We continued by stating, quote, perhaps thinking from a location where war and colonization are quotidian contexts of life, we should rethink what sexual injury is. But I realize now that diversifying the injury only continues the tyranny of the queer liberal subject sutured through its wounded attachment. Breaking with the attachment of liberal injury and woundedness means thinking alongside the bodies of the occupied, of the genocided, of those facing mass corporeal losses, of those positioned as disposable, a realm Nefertiti Tadier calls remaindered life. Those lives only valuable because they are expended towards the social reproduction and profiteering of others. It is to be reminded that what is queer are those bodies considered threatening, those bodies targeted for securitization, policing, and disposal. In a recently published collection titled Cairo Securitized, Paul Lamar, along with LGBTQ scholars and activists from Egypt, Omnia Khalil, Ahmed Awadallah, and Yahya Mohammed Salah, describe how fascist and authoritarian states deploy security state practices that generate sexualized, criminalized, and sanctioned subjects of social and moral panic. Securitization, they argue, involves a process of subjectification and abjection that feed from raced, classed, gendered, and sexed corporealities, bodies that are perceived as, quote, sources of radical insecurity and moral panic, end quote. Centering these relations to security dispenses with the need for cultural or archival translation through global north theoretical hegemonies, residing instead in their own queer and trans epistemes, forms of knowing, and authority. Departing from the subject or object of injury to bodies that are materialized through the securitizing forces of control societies, queer is expanded to any entity that is deemed an object of surveillance and disposability, thus lending a broader geopolitical and infrastructural emphasis to and for queer and trans theory. On November 12, 2023, 2 photos of note were posted on social media. By way of description, and as a mode of refusing to display them, the first image depicts an Israeli soldier holding a rainbow flag, hailed the first ever pride flag raised in Gaza, while standing on mounds of withering earth. On the flag was written, "In the name of love," above in English, below in Arabic. In the background, there are 2 army tanks, 3 semi-demolished buildings, and the rubble of genocide everywhere. The second image shows a soldier holding a superimposition of the flag of Israel with the Star of David and the rainbow flag. He is in front of a tank, which is next to another tank, and again, not much else except the scorched ground. In response to these images, queers in Palestine write, quote, under Israel's surveillance and police state, visibility, opacity, and invisibility are survival and resistance tactics we use interchangeably and aren't always a matter of choice, end quote. For nearly 2 decades, Palestinian queers in Palestine, from Al-Qaus, based in East Jerusalem, to Palestinian queers for BDS, to Aswat, based in Haifa, have been affirming their intersectional struggle. Quote, what we are working towards is a Palestine liberated from colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalist exploitation, end quote. It is important to note that queers in Palestine do not invoke the language of pinkwashing, the terms of which limit the possibilities for what Fred Moten has called solidarities without equivalence. So many had sent me these images asking for comment. I came to feel that the analytic matrices that I had developed earlier begged for some further specification, especially in the context of the rise of fascism worldwide and the explicit embrace and trumpeting of fascist statecraft coming from the Israeli government. The fascist racial state has, in large part and in many ways, dispensed with its liberal ideological facade. So the question is, what do we make of these images now? What kinds of work do they do? These stage scenes obviously invoke the violence of the liberal structures within which we are all entangled. Discussion of them on social media and in articles largely focused on pinkwashing and homonationalism. Insofar as pinkwashing describes the use of progressive LGBTQ rights as a cover for the occupation of Palestine, these images resonate with prior examples of such. Insofar as pinkwashing only makes sense in a context where LGBTQ rights are a mandated facet of liberal democracy, homonationalism is that context. Insofar as homonationalism is a structuring facet of international financial instruments like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which inveigh against homophobia in the global south and make a business case for LGBT inclusion, in other words, have metrics about the costs of homophobia. Homonationalism is a global form of soft power. Rahul Rao calls the monetary incentivizing of homosexual acceptance homocapitalism. This is a LGBTQ acceptance forged in interaction between elite LGBT activists and technocrats in international financial institutions. Insofar as homonationalism is a structuring facet of international governance, it continues to operate as a form of cultural imperialism. So, for example, NATO's web materials reveal that it is a self-proclaimed world leader in recognizing same-sex marriage. And we can see similar kinds of propaganda coming out from the US Marines and other military entities. So liberalism remains the ideology of the international order, working to normalize permanent war and extractive economies, all the while enabling fascism to thrive on the domestic nation-state front. So there's a question for me here about whether these well-worn terms, pinkwashing, homonationalism, homocapitalism, can speak to the current situation of genocide in Gaza. In Netanyahu's far-right cabinet, there are many who are avowedly homo and transphobic. What currency could these images possibly have in the context of this crumbling, quote-unquote, democracy? Does fascism need pinkwashing? Given the blanket impunity that the state of Israel currently enjoys, is pinkwashing, once wedded to a Brand Israel campaign to rehabilitate Israel's public image, even a necessary tool? Isn't the point of fascism the unapologetic licensing of violence towards racial others that is unbridled and unleashed? If fascism affirms the structural violence that liberalism disavows, with Netanyahu, the deflection is no longer needed. The fascist can enjoy the pleasure of violence that the liberal eschews. If, as Alberto Toscano has recently theorized in his new book, Late Fascisms, fascism is a structure and not an event, not a shift in governmentality, but a rearrangement of the sovereign rights to kill and maim, then we might be seeing the liberal facade of homonationalism emptied of its necessity, its utility, its ideological force. It is with some irony that we can note that the soldier in these photos and their supporters would be dispensed with by the Israeli state itself, given the solidification of anti-gender ideology. Trans and queer bodies are the glue for an international, global version of fascism that is otherwise carried by nation-state governance. So-called gender-critical movements driven by far-right fascists and TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, are gaining ground in numerous countries: Brazil, Hungary, the United States, the UK, Turkey, Poland, Romania, Israel, Canada, the list goes on. While many are concerned about the purported instrumentalization, co-optation, and cynical deployment of diversity of LGBTQ communities for conservative, right-wing, and nationalist ends, this discourse presumes the problem is the incorrect use of an otherwise pure, coherent, properly inhabited identity, and not the fantasy of this pure identity itself that undergirds these so-called contradictions. We would do well to deconstruct the idea of unholy alliances or strange bedfellows. These soldiers and their supporters are quite simply queers for genocide. They are not aberrations, but rather constitutive of a normative queer liberal rights project, one that is of course anti-fascist and yet continues to underwrite capitalist exploitation, dispossession, land grabs, and ethnic cleansing. So I don't see an Israeli soldier pinkwashing an occupation. I see pure delight, the licensing of sheer gratification from death and carnage. I do not see the free queer subject of rights. Rather, I see the subject that is liberated by the right to joyful killing, the joie de vivre of genocidal libido, what Laleh Khalili has called cruel jouissance. Here we have the petty sovereign carrying out the microfascisms of the macrofascist state. If in homonationalism, the right to the pleasure of the annihilation of racial others was projected onto queer proxies, the right to enjoy violence is openly expressed in fascist regimes. So there's a fundamental incommensurability at work in these images, the hollow and painful juxtaposition of the subject of rights in contrast to what it means to be on the land, a pathetic appeal to the so-called civilized versus the edifice upon which civilization was brutally built. We are meant to toggle between the imperial subject of LGBTQ rights in relation to the rightless colonized subject in need of rescue. We are meant to forget what a flag on a land has historically signified. But the liberated Israeli queer is not juxtaposed to the purported closeted Palestinian queer unable to unfurl a rainbow flag. The dispossession of land facilitates not only the emergence of the settler colonial state, but also the grounds for the figuration of the political subjects of representation. The erasure of Palestinians on their land, the erasure of Palestinian indigeneity, is the necessary precondition for this liberated queer to exist. Palestinian scholars Rana Barakat and Lana Tatur, among others, have shown us time and again that settler subjects appear as indigenous bodies disappear. If, as Native and indigenous scholars have taught us, indigenous bodies matter as the embodiment of land, then it is the collective relationality of a people and their land, and not individual rights, that forms the ground of future governance. Land back is therefore not a metaphor, rather the material heart of and the precursor to true sexual, gender, economic, and racial liberation. Palestinians, queer, trans, non-binary, and otherwise, want their land back. And this is a closing section. To bear witness to history is a privilege and a severity that we cannot accept lightly, writes critical race studies scholar Sharon Luke. A liberatory demand from queers in Palestine is a document that calls on feminist, queer, and trans activists to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. As feminist, queer, and trans scholar activists, many of us have been askew to the university, and we must now insist on being even more askew than ever. We must call upon our feminist, queer, and trans theories and our feminist, queer, and trans theorists to speak to genocide, to allow Palestine and Palestinians to teach us, to provincialize our global North academies, to refuse the silencing, to challenge our quiet colleagues, and perhaps most importantly, to interrogate and diffuse our own liberal sensibilities. As Robin Kelly and too many others have noted, the silence of liberal academies everywhere has been deafening. Rod Ferguson, remarking on the twin and intertwined banishing of critical race theory, which Jennifer commented on earlier, and free speech on Palestine in the United States, describes this as the social reproduction of cowardice, which is, of course, the social reproduction of status, privilege, and the status quo. It is quite telling that, unlike, say, a decade ago, Undergraduate and graduate students, junior faculty, and adjuncts are fearlessly out front on this issue, while as usual, so many tenured academics remain silent. This is a shift that portends the refusal to be complicit with business as usual in the university. I want to honor the great costs of time, resources, and energy that our Palestinian and Arab colleagues are expending to educate the rest of us while facing such backlash and dismissal, and to lift up the tremendous work of student organizers across North American campuses. And I also want to mark how the labor to fight for academic freedom on university campuses is being disproportionately borne, despite this fight affecting, make no mistake, every single one of us. We, and by we, I mean Global North academies and their proxies in the Global South, are in a battle not only over what we can teach and what we can say, but as Robin Kelley remarks, over what we can think, over the very possibility to think. In the afterword to Maya Win's recently published book, Towers of Ivory and Steel, How Israeli Universities Deny Palestinian Freedom, Kelley writes that, quote, Israeli apartheid could not exist without liberal silence, and then details the mutually reinforcing links between the unraveling of democracy in the United States and the fascist government of Israel. Arguing that, quote, the silence of liberals has hastened the deteriorating intellectual and political climate in the United States, Kelley makes clear that Palestine can no longer be treated as a peripheral or indifferent object to anyone invested in the future of academic institutions in North America. Writing from the University of Cape Town on, quote, the export of theory from the global north to the global south as a form of soft power, Black feminist disability studies anthropologist Karnitha Mohammed wonders about, quote, epistemic proscriptions and ontological erasures that travel, and about the value of thinking with proscriptive theorizations from the global north. Transnational solidarities based in ethical and epistemic claims force the issue, argues Mohammed, of what it means to, quote, use theory written by people who refuse to bear witness to or speak out against the annihilatory scale of suffering being inflicted in Gaza, end quote. It is therefore more important than ever to connect with Palestinian scholars and activists, to read and teach their work in the face of ongoing scholasticide, to elevate the voices of Palestinian feminists, Nadra Shalab-Kevorkian, who, by the way, was just suspended by the Hebrew University last week, Rima Hamami, Shireen Sekli, Frances Hasso, Sarah Ahmoud, Rabab Abdul Hadi, Isla Jad, Kadir Shafi, Haneen Maiki, among others. So these are the questions about theoretical knowledge production that weigh heavily on me these days. How do we rethink what counts as intellectual labor in this moment, given the vast expenditure of some to hold universities accountable to the exercise of academic freedom and to fight the increasing restrictions on Palestine speech, especially given that college campuses may remain the last places of public discourse to be able to openly engage debate? What can we do to redirect resources from the academy to undertake the work of collective study in and beyond the university so necessary to address our calamitous times? In other words, intellectual work done not in the name of individual research, but in the service of a freer academy. In what ways must we be accountable to the imperial circuits of knowledge production that are otherwise staged as transnational, decolonial, and intersectional affinities? These are, of course, not new questions, but they are newly urgent in our current context. Thank you.